Good night, everyone. Today we're gonna read the fairy tale which everyone used to like to listen before going to bed. This story is about love, and it is called The Sleeping Beauty. Once upon a time, there lived a king and a queen who had no children. They were so sorry about having no children that I cannot tell you how sorry they were. At last, however, after many years, the queen had a daughter. There was a very fine christening for the baby princess. The king and the queen looked throughout the kingdom for fairies to be her godmothers, and they found 7 fairies. Each fairy godmother was to give the princess a gift, as was the custom of fairies in those days. In this way, the princess had all the perfections imaginable. After the christening ceremony was over, the whole party returned to the king's palace, where there was prepared a great feast for the 7 fairy godmothers. There was placed before each one of them a magnificent case of gold, in which were a spoon, knife, and a fork, all of pure gold set with diamonds and rubies. But as everyone was sitting down at the table, they saw come into the hall a very old fairy, whom they had not invited because she had not left the tower where she lived for over 50 years, and she was believed to be either dead or under an evil spell. The king could not give her a case of gold as the others had been given, because they had only 7 made for 7 fairies. The old fairy felt insulted and muttered some threats between her teeth. One of the young fairies who sat by her overheard how she grumbled, and guessing that she might give the little princess an unlucky gift, went as soon as they rose from table and hid behind the curtains, so that she might make the last wish for the little princess and use it to put right any evil that the old fairy might do with her magic spell. Meanwhile, all the fairies began to give their gifts to the princess. The youngest wished that she should be the most beautiful person in the world. The next, that she should have the intelligence of an angel. The third, that she should have a wonderful grace in everything she did. The fourth, that she should dance perfectly well. The fifth, that she should sing like a nightingale. And the sixth, that she should play all the kinds of music to the utmost perfection. The old fairy turn came next, and shaking her head more despite than anger, said that one day the princess would have her hand pricked by a needle on a spinning wheel, and that she should die of the wound. This terrible gift made the whole company tremble, and everybody began to cry. At this very instant, the young fairy came out from behind the curtains and spoke these words aloud. Assure yourselves, O king and queen, that your daughter shall not die of this disaster. It is true, I have no power to undo entirely what the elder fairy has done. The princess shall indeed pierce her hand with the needle on a spinning wheel, but instead of dying, she shall only fall into a deep sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the end of which a king's son shall come and awake her. The king, to avoid the misfortune foretold by the old fairy, immediately made a law by which everybody was forbidden, on pain of death, to use a spinning wheel or to have any spinning wheel in their houses. About 15 or 16 years later, on a day when the king and queen were busy in a far corner of the vast palace, the young and beautiful princess amused herself by running up and down the corridors and going up from one apartment to another. Eventually, she came into a little room at the top of the tower, where a good old woman alone was spinning with her wheel, for this good old woman had never heard of the king's law against spinning wheels. The princess said, "What are you doing there, good old woman?" "I am spinning sheep's wool into thread so that I can knit it into a cardigan." "Ha," said the princess, "that's very clever. I've never seen that before. How do you do it? Give it to me so that I may see it if I can do the same." Now, whether it was because she was in too much of a hurry, or whether it was because she was clumsy, or whether it was because the old fairy had wished it so, I cannot say. But no sooner than the princess took the spinning wheel than she pricked her hand on the needle, and she fell down in a faint. The good old woman, not knowing what to do, cried out for help. People came rushing from all over the palace, and they came in great numbers. When they saw the princess lying in a deep, deep sleep on the floor, they threw cold water on her face. They loosened her clothes, They struck her on the palms of her hands, and they rubbed her temples with smelling salts. But nothing they could do would awaken the princess. The king, who heard the great commotion from the far end of the palace, remembered the terrible warning of the fairies, and guessing what had happened, came rushing to the tower. There he saw the princess lying in a deep, deep sleep, and he ordered her to be carried into the finest apartment in his palace, and to be laid upon a bed all embroidered with gold and silver. If you had seen her, you might have taken her for a little angel. She was so very beautiful, for her swooning away had not paled her complexion. Her cheeks were like roses, and her lips were like sea coral. Indeed, her eyes were shut, but she was heard to breathe softly, which persuaded everyone that she was not dead. The king commanded that they should not disturb her, but let her sleep quietly until her hour of awakening was come. When this accident happened to the princess, the good fairy, who had saved her life by condemning her to sleep for 100 years, was in the kingdom of Madakin, 12,000 miles away. But she quickly heard the terrible news from a little dwarf who had 100 miles boots, that is, boots with which he could tread over 100 miles of ground in a single step. The fairy came immediately, and she arrived at the palace about an hour later. The king took her hand as she stepped out of the chariot, and they both went to look at the sleeping princess. As the fairy was very good at thinking and planning ahead, she realized that in 100 years' time, when the princess would wake up, she might not know what to do with herself, being all alone in this old palace. So this was what she did. She touched with her went everything in the palace, except the king and queen, nannies, maids of honor, ladies of the bedchamber, gentlemen, officers, stewards, cooks, undercooks, cleaners, guards with their beefeaters, pages, and footmen. She also touched all the horses in the stables and fields, the fierce guards' dogs in the outer court, and pretty little Mopsy too, the princess' little puppy, which lay by her on the bed. Immediately, as soon as she touched them, they all fell asleep, so that they might not awaken before their princess, and that they might be ready to serve her when she wanted them. Even the great fires in the ovens of the kitchen that were just then roasting pheasants fell asleep too. All this was done in a moment. fairies do not take long to finish their business. Now the king and the queen, having kissed their dear child without waking her, went out of the palace and made an order that nobody should dare to come near it. This, however, was not necessary, for in a quarter of an hour's time there grew up all around about the palace grounds such a vast number of trees, great and small, bushes and brambles, that neither man nor beast could pass through, so that nothing could be seen but the very top of the towers of the palace. Nobody doubted but the fairy had demonstrated a very extraordinary sample of her power, that the princess, while she continued sleeping, might have nothing to fear from any curious people. When 100 years had passed by, the son of a king from another family had gone a-hunting in that part of the country where the palace used to be. He asked, "What are those towers in the middle of the great thick wood?" Everyone answered with the rumors that they had heard. Some said that it was a ruinous old castle haunted by spirits. Others that all the witches of the country used to meet there at midnight when there was a full moon. Most people believed that an ogre lived there and that he used to take there all the little children he could catch, so that he could eat them whenever he pleased, without anybody being able to follow him, as only he had the power to pass through the wood.